She sat on the sidewalk, soot on her face, the smell of gasoline still clinging to her clothes. Flames roared behind her, devouring everything she had ever known. When the police arrived, she didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply said, "I did it." What drives a 20-year-old girl to burn down her own home, with her entire family trapped inside? Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a victim pushed past the breaking point? The truth behind this horrifying case is far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Insoector Stan, where we uncover the darkest tales of tragedy, survival, and justice. 17-year-old Zamaria Holloway had always been seen as a quiet, peculiar girl in her small Louisiana town. She carried the kind of sadness that made people uneasy, a darkness in her eyes that her teachers noticed but never questioned. There was something unsettling about the way she moved, cautious, as if she were waiting for the next blow to land. She never spoke out of turn. Never asked for help. Never let anyone get too close. No one knew. What she had never dared to speak was that she had been enduring a nightmare since she was 9 years old. Her grandfather, 67-year-old Albert, Big L, Holloway, had been raping her for almost a decade, a sick family secret that her own mother, Nadira, ignored. Nadira, a bitter woman hardened by years of bad relationships and worse choices, had always known. She had grown up in the same toxic household, where silence was expected, and suffering was passed down like an heirloom. To her, Zamaria was just another girl in a long line of women who had to deal with it. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that she had nowhere else to go, that there were worse things in the world. She let it happen. Rahim, her stepfather, was no better. He had done time, seen things, lived through a system that had chewed him up and spit him back out angrier than before. He had no love for Zamaria, barely even acknowledged her existence unless it was to remind her she was nothing. He tolerated her, but just barely. When his temper flared, when the weight of his own failures became too much, she became another outlet for his rage. A slap, a shove, a sharp word meant to cut deep. He never asked what went on between Big L and his stepdaughter. It wasn't his business. Zamaria had learned early that there was no rescue coming. No knight in shining armor, no sympathetic teacher who would pull her aside and ask the right questions. She was alone. Except for her younger twin siblings. Zaire and Zayana. 9 years old. Innocent, untouched by the filth that consumed the Holloway house. Zamaria adored them, protected them, did everything in her power to shield them from the truth. She tucked them in at night, sang to them when they were scared, whispered stories of faraway places where monsters didn't live inside your home. She didn't know if she could save herself. But she knew one thing for certain, she would not let them grow up in the same hell. The years had blurred together into one endless nightmare. Zamaria had lost count of how many times she had stared at the ceiling, willing herself to disappear while Big L took what he wanted. The nights bled into mornings, the pain dulled only by the numbness she had forced upon herself. She had learned to survive in silence. Her body was no longer hers, it was a vessel for suffering, a thing to be used and discarded. Her mind was the only escape, a battlefield where she fought to keep what little remained of herself alive. The routine never changed. Big L would come in reeking of sweat and whiskey, his voice thick with empty reassurances. "Ain't nobody gonna love you like I do." Lies wrapped in poison. She stopped fighting long ago. Resistance only made it worse. The public continued to notice the deadness in her eyes. They had seen the bruises she tried to hide. But no one ever asked. No one ever stepped in. The Holloway house had always been a place of suffering, and the world had long since decided it wasn't their problem. And so, the years crawled by. By 17, Zamaria was no longer a girl but a hollowed-out shell of a woman, her soul battered and worn. The weight of it all pressed down on her, heavier than it had ever been. She had endured over a decade of hell, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself otherwise, she knew, it would never stop. Then came another night. Another violation. Another moment where she lay still and silent, waiting for it to be over. And then something inside her snapped. Maybe it had been building for years, waiting for the right moment to shatter the last of her restraint. Maybe it had been fate. Maybe it had always been inevitable. But in that moment, as Big L grunted above her, his weight suffocating, his breath thick with the stench of evil, Zamaria decided. If she didn't end it, it would never end. Zamaria felt it before she understood it. A stillness. A terrifying sense of calm, the kind that settled deep in her bones like it had always been waiting for her. It was different from the numbness she had carried for so long. This wasn't survival. This was clarity. She moved through the house that night with a quiet certainty, her bare feet light against the wooden floor. The walls that had trapped her, the rooms that had swallowed her screams, the ceiling she had stared at for years while enduring the unthinkable, it would all be gone soon. Reduced to ash. She had waited until they were asleep. Nadira, passed out in her usual drunken haze. Rahim, snoring like a beast in their bedroom, a half-finished bottle of cheap whiskey on the nightstand. The twins, Zaire and Zayana, curled up together in their tiny bed, breathing softly, unaware of the storm brewing around them. And then there was him. Big L. He lay sprawled on the couch, one hand resting over his bloated stomach, the other gripping a remote that had long since slipped from his fingers. He looked peaceful in his sleep, like he wasn't a monster, like he wasn't the reason she had spent her life suffocating under the weight of his sickness. For a fleeting moment, she thought about stopping. About walking away. About pretending she could live the rest of her life carrying this darkness and never letting it swallow her whole. But then she remembered. She remembered the nights. The hands. The pain. The way he had stolen her childhood and worn it like a crown. The way Nadira had let it happen. The way Rahim had looked right through her. And just like that, the hesitation was gone. She moved quickly, efficiently. She had planned this moment carefully, rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times. The gasoline sloshed in a container as she poured it, the sharp scent burning her nose, but she didn't cough. She didn't flinch. She soaked the carpets first, watching as the liquid seeped into the fibers. The stairs, the baseboards, the doorways. She moved room by room, a ghost drifting through the house, ensuring there would be no escape. By the time she reached the living room, she was almost done. Big L didn't stir as she stood over him, matchbook in hand. She studied him for a moment, memorizing the face of the man who had ruined her. The sagging skin, the yellowed teeth, the slight twitch in his lip as he slept. He had always been so sure of his power over her. So sure that she would never fight back. Zamaria bent down, just close enough to whisper. "I hope you burn in hell." Then, she struck the match. It flared to life, small and fragile, but she knew better than to underestimate fire. It was hungry. It was final. She let it fall. The flames moved faster than she expected. The gasoline carried them with a violent hunger, licking up the couch, racing across the floorboards, climbing the walls like they had been waiting for this moment too. Within seconds, the house erupted into chaos. Screams pierced the night. Nadira's shriek was the first, raw and disoriented. Rahim's voice followed, laced with confusion and terror. The twins, oh, the twins, Zamaria's heart clenched as she heard Zayana's frantic cries, Zaire calling for help. But she didn't move. She stood in the yard, bathed in the glow of the inferno, watching as the house burned. Big L never made it out. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The Holloway house, the house of horrors, the prison she had been trapped in her entire life, was nothing more than collapsing beams and smoldering ruin. And Zamaria? She didn't run. She didn't hide. She just stood there, staring into the flames, as the world around her finally crumbled to ash. The Holloway house no longer existed. What was once a battered, rotting structure filled with suffering was now nothing more than a pile of smoldering ash. The blackened remains of walls stood in jagged ruins, stubbornly refusing to collapse entirely, as if even in death, the house wanted to hold on to its horrors. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt wood, melted plastic, and something worse, something unmistakably human. The bodies inside were unrecognizable. 5 corpses. Nadira, Rahim, Albert, Big L, Holloway, Zaire, and Zayana. What was left of them was barely distinguishable from the charred debris around them. The fire had done its job mercilessly, leaving nothing but skeletal remains, some still curled as if they had been trying to shield themselves from the heat. Zamaria stood at the edge of it all, barefoot on the damp grass, the flickering red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles painting her in eerie flashes of color. The chaos around her was deafening, firefighters shouting orders, neighbors whispering in horror, police officers moving with tense urgency. And yet, she was calm. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She didn't plead for help or ask about the others. She only watched. When the officers finally approached her, their faces were tight with suspicion. She had no burns, no injuries, nothing to suggest she had tried to escape or save anyone. Just a girl standing still in the middle of a nightmare she had created. A young cop, no older than 25, hesitated before speaking. "Miss, are you hurt?" Zamaria tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Hurt. The word felt foreign. Pain had been her constant companion for so long that she wasn't sure she even recognized it anymore. Instead of answering, she simply turned to the nearest officer, an older man with tired eyes and a hardened expression, and spoke the only words that mattered. "I did it." A hush fell over the crowd. The murmurs stopped. Even the firefighters, who had been working to fully extinguish the last stubborn flames, slowed in their movements. "You, what?" the officer asked, as if he had misheard her. Zamaria's voice didn't waver. "I set the fire. I killed them." There was no shock in her tone. No guilt. No fear. Just the simple, undeniable truth. She didn't fight when they grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back. She didn't flinch when the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She didn't so much as blink when they read her rights. "Do you understand?" the officer asked. Zamaria nodded once. Yes. She understood perfectly. As they led her toward the squad car, heads turned, people whispered, neighbors who had once ignored her suffering now watching her like she was some kind of monster. And maybe she was. But monsters weren't born. They were made. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread. The headlines were brutal. Louisiana woman murders entire family in house fire. Horror in the Holloway home, arson or pure evil. Survivor or killer. The truth about Zamaria Holloway. The news stations replayed the footage over and over, the young woman standing motionless as her home burned behind her, the haunting image of her in handcuffs, her face unreadable, almost eerily calm. At first, she was painted as a monster. The media called her remorseless, cold-blooded, a killer with no emotion. They speculated about her mental state, debated whether she had simply snapped or if she had always been a danger to those around her. But then, the truth started to come out. It started small. A former teacher, who had always suspected something was wrong but never pressed further, came forward. Then a neighbor, who had seen the bruises but never asked. Then an old friend, who had drifted away after realizing Zamaria never talked about her home life. And then, someone leaked the real story. The abuse. The silence. The horror that had festered inside the Holloway house for over a decade. People weren't sure what to think anymore. Was she a villain? Or was she a victim who had finally done what no one else would? As the media fought to rewrite the narrative, Zamaria sat alone in a cold jail cell, staring at the walls, waiting. She had already been trapped in one prison her entire life. This one? It didn't feel much different. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras ready to capture every tear, every glare, every moment of the trial that had split the nation in half. On one side, people called her a murderer, a cold-blooded killer who had slaughtered her own family in their sleep. On the other, voices rose in her defense, calling her a survivor, a victim of a lifetime of horrors who had finally snapped. Zamaria sat at the defense table, dressed in a plain beige prison uniform, her wrists shackled, her expression unreadable. The girl who had spent her life silent now had the whole world speaking for her, dissecting her every move, debating whether she was a monster or a martyr. The prosecutor, a sharp-jawed man with a voice like a blade, painted her as a calculated killer. She had options, he told the jury, his voice thick with disdain. She could have run away. She could have told someone. But instead, she planned this. She waited until they were sleeping. She poured gasoline through the house. She stood there and watched as they burned. He turned to face Zamaria, his gaze hard. That is not the act of a victim. That is the act of a murderer. The words landed heavily in the room. Whispers rippled through the gallery. People shook their heads. Zamaria barely moved. Then came the defense. Her lawyer, an older black woman with fire in her eyes, stood tall, unshaken. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every woman who had ever been silenced, every child who had ever suffered in the shadows. You say she had options, she asked, stepping toward the jury. Tell me, what options did a little girl have when the man who was supposed to protect her decided to own her instead? When her own mother looked away. When the people in this town saw the bruises, saw the sadness, and chose to do nothing. She let the silence hang in the air before continuing. This was not a crime of cold-blooded murder. This was the final act of a girl who had been tortured since she was a child. A girl who knew that if she didn't put an end to it, it would never stop. Tell me, would you have saved her? Would anyone? The jury shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Psychiatrists took the stand next. They spoke of severe PTSD, dissociation, deep psychological scars that had festered inside her since childhood. They described how trauma warps the mind, how years of abuse had rewired Zamaria's brain until violence was the only escape she could see. She wasn't thinking like a rational adult, one expert testified. She was thinking like a child trapped in a nightmare, reacting the only way she knew how. The nation watched, the debate growing louder. Some called her a victim of circumstance, a girl who had been born into a horror story with no way out. Others said she was dangerous, a murderer who had chosen revenge over justice. And then, finally, it was time for the verdict. Zamaria stood, hands cuffed in front of her, as the jury foreman rose. The room was silent. People held their breath. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty but mentally ill. A murmur of voices, gasps, anger, relief. The judge's voice cut through the noise like a gavel to the skull. Zamaria Holloway, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She didn't react. No tears. No anger. No shock. She simply exhaled, slow and steady, as if she had already known, deep down, that freedom had never been meant for her. As they led her away, the courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Some wept. Some screamed that justice had been done, while others cried that justice had been denied. But Zamaria? She just walked, one foot in front of the other, toward another prison. Because in the end, it didn't matter. She had already been sentenced the moment she was born into the Holloway house. The flames had long since died, but the Holloway fire still burned in the minds of the people. The town that once ignored Zamaria's suffering now couldn't stop talking about her. Every diner, every barbershop, every church pew became a courtroom of its own. Was she a victim, a tragic soul who had been backed into a corner with no way out? Or was she a murderer, a woman who had made the ultimate, unforgivable choice? It depended on who you asked. To some, she was a symbol of pain ignored too long. They saw in her the ghosts of every girl who had suffered in silence, every child who had been told to endure what should never be endured. They whispered her name in sympathy, wrote letters to the governor pleading for clemency. She should have been saved long before that night. The abuse was horrible, they admitted, but so was what she did. The twins. That was the sticking point for most. Zaire and Ziana were only 9, innocent, unaware of the darkness that had swallowed their sister whole. She had no right, people said, shaking their heads. Those babies didn't deserve that. But then came the counterargument, cold and brutal: if she had left them behind, would they have been next? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The house was gone. Bulldozed within weeks, as if erasing the structure could erase what had happened inside it. But it didn't matter. The story still lingered. It lived in the news specials, in the podcasts dissecting every detail, in the college students writing theses on intergenerational trauma and the cycle of abuse. It lived in the debates, the heated arguments between those who swore she had no other choice and those who said she had crossed an unforgivable line. Most of all, it lived in Zamaria herself. In her cell, she existed in a limbo of her own making. Not free, not dead. Just there. The guards didn't know what to make of her. She never cried, never fought, never showed fear. She simply existed, moving through the days as if they didn't belong to her. One day, a reporter asked the only question that mattered. "Do you feel free?" Zamaria stared at them for a long time. And then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know what freedom feels like." This case forces us to confront the darkest corners of human suffering. Zamaria was both a victim and an offender, a girl who lost her childhood before she ever had a chance to live it. Every horrific detail of her past built up like dry kindling, and when the flames finally came, they consumed everything. But what do we do with someone like Zamaria? Do we see her as a monster, or as a broken sea? Was this justice, or just another tragedy? And that brings us to the question, was Zamaria's sentence fair? Should trauma excuse crime, or does the law demand accountability no matter the circumstances? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this story left you speechless, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more cases that explore the thin line between victim and villain.